Thank you. The Assembly Committee on Government Affairs will come to order. Madam Secretary, please call roll.
Assemblywoman Anderson.
Present.
Assemblywoman Black.
Here.
Assemblywoman Brown May.
Here.
Assemblywoman Considine.
Present.
Assemblywoman Dickman.
Here.
Assemblywoman Duran.
Here.
Assemblyman Ellison.
Present.
Assemblywoman Martinez.
Present.
Assemblyman Matthews.
Here.
Assemblyman MacArthur.
Here.
Assemblywoman Thomas.
Here.
Assemblywoman Torres.
Here.
Chair Flores.
Present. Please let the record reflect all members are present. We have a quorum. Good morning, members. As always, housekeeping. I want to remind everybody, please keep your microphone on mute unless you are speaking. And if you got to shut off your camera for any reason, just give us a quick heads up so we understand what's happening. For those of you following us virtually, welcome to your Committee on Government Affairs. As always, thank you for joining us this morning. I want to give you a quick rundown so that everybody has some clarity as to how we'll be managing the agenda this morning. We're going to take the agenda slightly out of order, and we'll be hearing Assembly Bill 340 first, followed by Assembly 378, and then lastly, Assembly Bill 249, for the sake of accommodating folk who have multiple presentations simultaneously happening. So we're going to switch that order around. Apologies to anybody who didn't get a heads up earlier on that. And then at the very end, we'll be doing public comment. So with that, we'll start off with Assembly Bill 340. Assemblyman Matthews, good morning, welcome. And
Good morning. Yes, good morning. Thank you, Chair Flores. Thank you, members of the Committee on Government Affairs. I'm Andy Matthews. I represent District 37 in the Nevada Assembly. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting Assembly Bill 340. I'll start with a brief introduction and overview, and then I've got two other co-presenters with me today who will make some remarks of their own. The objective of this bill is to bring a greater legislative oversight to the process of writing regulations here in our state. Currently, a lot of authority is given to executive branch agencies when it comes to unilaterally crafting and instituting some new regulations. And while that is certainly practical and even necessary in some cases, when we're talking about regulations with a very significant economic impact, I believe it would serve the people of Nevada much better if we, the people's elected accountable representatives, had a role and a voice in that process. So under this bill, for any new proposed regulation, an economic analysis would have to be conducted to determine the regulation's likely economic impact. And then regulations with an estimated impact over $10 million could be enacted only through a vote of the legislature. Now, you'll notice that the bill as written has or provides for the agency itself conducting that analysis. But I have a conceptual amendment which should be posted on Nellis, I believe it is, that would actually require that analysis to be done by an independent entity. And I feel that this independence in that analysis is really crucial from the standpoint of accountability. The $10 million figure is consistent with the one other state in the country that currently has this law in place, and that is the state of Wisconsin. I'm anticipating a likely question from committee members regarding how many regulations here in Nevada would be subject to that threshold. And the answer is that we really don't know. I've worked with our LCB staff on this, and the challenge, the bottom line is that because this law has not been in place to this point, the data that would be needed to determine the answer to that question has not been collected. However, going forward, If this bill were to become law, we would, of course, start collecting that data, and we'd be in a position to know how many regulations are subject to that threshold, and also to know whether that $10 million threshold is appropriate and practical, or whether an adjustment would need to be made going forward. And along the way, of course, we would have the tremendous benefit from the inherent value of actually getting these analyses done regarding how much these regulations are costing our citizens and our businesses, which is information that's good for us to know in any case. So the bottom line on AB 340 is that it's not about stopping necessary regulations from being put in place. It's simply a way to make sure that the agencies aren't allowed to be on sort of autopilot during that process. Smaller regulations would still be implemented as under the current process. But for those more costly and impactful regulations, at least, we, the people's elected representatives, should and now would be able to be at the table and have the authority to review them before deciding whether they truly serve the interests of those we are elected to represent. And AB 340 would accomplish that important goal. So I thank you for considering this bill. I'd now like to turn things over to Marcos Lopez, who is the legislative liaison for Americans for Prosperity of Nevada. Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, Assemblyman, Chair Flores, members of the committee. So fundamentally, what AB 340 is, it's building upon and strengthening the legislative review provisions that we already have under our Nevada Constitution, that we already have in the Nevada Administrative Procedure Act, but it just strengthens that. Fundamentally, this bill is about transparency. Fundamentally, this bill is about checks and balances. We, in recent decades, it has been a phenomenon across the entire nation at every level of government, that the lawmaking authority of the legislature keeps getting pushed off to the executive branch and its agencies. So what we believe is that we need to make sure that the legislative bodies have input and review it to make sure they're holding to the intent of the legislation that you guys pass. And there's real effects to all of this. In all this regulations has been associated with an increase from 1997 to 2015, and Nevada's regulatory burden has been associated with an increase in the number of people living in poverty by 52,518, and an increase in the poverty rate by 1.76 percentage points. These are real effects that real Nevadans are having to deal with. So we need to make sure that we are reining this in and we're keeping an eye on what effect these are having on people. And the evidence strongly suggests that Nevada needs some reforms. And this is a big problem when we can't quantify the cost of many of these regulations. The fact that we weren't able to get an answer on how many regulations this would affect or how many rules would be affected by this shows that we're kind of grasping in the dark in terms of our cost benefit analysis. And we're making decisions that affects millions of Nevadans, and that is slowing our growth, that is putting more burdens on low income families. And when we see other jurisdictions that have engaged in red tape reduction in the US and Canada and other states, we don't see any diminished protection for health. We don't see any diminished protections for safety. Instead, what we see is increasing economic success. And we look at our ranking in a lot of different scales of our ability for business and our friendliness, we are increasingly sliding down in our rank as a state. And as we're looking to post-pandemic, as we're looking to post-COVID, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that we are getting back to where we were prior to the pandemic, which was a top performing state. We have extremely low unemployment. I also have with me Eric Bolt, who is State Director for Americans for Prosperity in Wisconsin, which is currently the one state that has implemented this, but we're also working in other states like Montana to get this passed, and we're exploring these options. I know if Eric wants to share a little bit about the Wisconsin experience.
Thank you. And thank you, committee members and Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak briefly with you today. My name is Eric Bott. I am the State Director of Americans for Prosperity Wisconsin, and I had the pleasure over about a 5-year period to help craft and ultimately see through enactment the nation's first state-level REINS Act in the state of Wisconsin. It was enacted in August 2017. And as the other speakers have mentioned, the real goal here is to restore legislative authority to the legislature that over time in many states has been ceded to the executive branch. And in doing so, we feel it should better connect the citizens to their democracy. We think that legislators, that you all have more accountability to the public, and that there's more transparency when you're involved in significant laws that have the ability to impact the lives and livelihoods of those people that you represent. In Wisconsin, there was a particular regulation that really sparked interest in the legislature and the executive branch in regulatory reform of this nature. And that was a 2010 phosphorus discharge regulation that ultimately had a $7 billion impact on key industries in our state. Wisconsin, we're the cheese state, and this was a regulation that threatened to shutter a significant portion of our cheese making industry, as well as our paper industry and our food processing industry, of which we are the national leader. The need for a REINS Act really was highlighted by that regulation. The idea that we would ever pass a tax hike, for instance, of $7 billion without the legislature getting to have a say on it seems absurd, but something similar happened here, to the detriment of our economy and to the detriment of thousands of family supporting, in many cases, union jobs. And so interest grew in the legislature to regain some of the authority they had previously ceded to the agencies. And in doing so, the legislature passed a law requiring an independent economic impact analysis of that regulation I mentioned. And I think it's worth noting, when the state agency, the DNR in Wisconsin, promulgated that regulation, they did their internal economic review and determined the rule would have a net positive impact of $18 million in the state's economy. When an independent economic analysis was conducted, it was determined that the rule would have a cost of $7 billion to the state, a wide disparity, and that does to me show the need and the importance of an independent review to be included in the consideration of such a proposal. Thus far, we've been operating under this rule for about 3 years. Has not been triggered. The REINS Act has not been triggered yet in Wisconsin. Our feeling is that it has improved the quality of rulemaking in the state. It has improved transparency and the level of communication between regulators and the regulated community and the legislature, as regulators seek to avoid triggering additional process in the implementation of their rules. So it has, I think, had a very positive impact thus far, and it has not resulted at this point in significant additional workload on the legislature or any other burdens. So thank you for your time. Be happy to assist in answering any questions about our experience in Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez, and thank you, Mr. Bott. Just as for the benefit of the committee, you heard Mr. Bott refer to the term the REINS Act, and that's sort of becomes sort of the name for this concept. And that's REINS, R-E-I-N-S. It's an acronym, of course, and it kind of stems from the initial concept for this, which I believe was at the federal level, and obviously the use of the term REINS referring to reining in the executive branch on this. So, thank you both, co-presenters, and we're happy to answer any questions you all might have. Thank you.
And thank you, Assemblyman, and thank you, Mr. Lopez and Mr. Bott, for joining us this morning. Look forward to the dialogue. Members, we'll start off with questions. And we'll start off with Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Assemblyman Matthews, for bringing this bill. I actually found the REINS Act last night when I was reviewing this bill, and it seems like it's something that's been in Congress for like over a decade, but hasn't passed. But I was able to do a little bit of research on it to kind of try to understand it. And I know that you've already talked about this question, but my big question is, what regulations do cost $10 million? And I understand that, maybe there has to be some sort of a study to find out what necessarily those are, but there has to be like some. I'm just wondering, when you work with LCB or whatever, if you had like 2, 3, 5, that are good examples to show us, what that 10 million regulation level would be.
Yeah, Andy Matthews, District 37, Assemblyman, for the record. Thank you, Assemblywoman, for the question. And it is an important question, and that has been the challenge, is to try to hone in on what types of regulations would be subject to this, and my apologies for not being able to provide that. That is really the challenge, because this hasn't been in place, because that information and data has not been collected. We're really left in a situation where we truly don't know, and I don't want to kind of do a disservice here by guessing or speculating. To some extent, you can bring a common sense test to a particular regulation and determine this is a larger one that may trigger it. But absent that data, it's hard to know with certainty. And I do think, the reason like I said in my opening remarks, the reason I set the threshold at that $10 million level is to be consistent, with the state that has this in place. I do think it's important that were this to be implemented, we would begin to get that information. And that's extremely valuable in of itself to know, to be looking at, what are these regulations costing our economy? And then we can make that determination of how often is that this being triggered, how many of these regulations would be subject to it. And then lawmakers going forward could make an assessment on whether that $10 million threshold really is the appropriate and practical level, or whether an adjustment needs to be made. So I wish I had that information, and I did spend a lot of time working with our staff on that. And it's not their fault, by the way, either. They can't provide access to information that simply doesn't exist. That's one of the chief goals on this, is to make sure we're actually starting to get this data. Mr. Bott, Mr. Lopez, feel free to add to that as you see fit.
Chair Flores, to Assemblywoman, through you. One piece of information can help us guide this. I put some supplemental information from the Mercatus Center, which they did a snapshot of the regulatory regime in Nevada, and we can kind of start getting a picture of which industries and what chapters include the most regulations. And I would feel that, that's probably a good gauge to start looking at what issues we will be talking about if this legislation is passed and the agencies start doing these economic impact analysis.
Follow-up, Chair?
Follow-up.
Thank you. So I guess my next question would be then, if we are considering Wisconsin sort of the same level as us, if we're going to do the 10 million, and this law is already in effect in Wisconsin, do you have like 3, 4, 5 examples of regulations in Wisconsin that have hit this 10 million?
Andy Matthews, District 37, Solomon, for the record. Yeah, I will defer to Mr. Bott on that. I think, as he said, there's not yet been a regulation proposed that has triggered this, but Mr. Bott, I'm sure, can speak a little bit more to what the experience has been there.
Sure. As I said, thus far, the last 3 years, we have not had a new regulation that triggered the $10 million threshold. However, during the mid to late 2000s and into the early 2010s, Wisconsin saw a number of very high cost regulations proposed and many implemented, predominantly through our Department of Natural Resources, water and air rules primarily. In recent history, we've seen a water rule with a 9-figure estimated cost proposed, but it was ultimately withdrawn by the agency. And so in recent times, we haven't seen it. But I think, in terms of our state, rules that could potentially exceed a $10 million threshold, we're probably talking about natural resources issues, potentially health, potentially transportation. Most agencies probably won't ever hit that threshold with the types of regulations that they enact. But on occasion, we see rules that far exceed that.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. I just am curious as to, if we don't know, and if Wisconsin hasn't had that issue, why we're creating a law for something we don't even know whether or not it's an issue yet. So that's just what I'm trying to find out. Thank you.
I don't think you have a response to that, correct? Understood. So next we'll go to Assemblywoman Thomas.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you, Assemblywoman Matthews, for your presentation. I just have a question. When you had mentioned your conceptual amendment, and then you said that you would have an independent audit, what was the cost of that?
Andy Matthews, District 37, Solomon, for the record. Yeah, we really want to make sure that that we're not creating an undue burden in terms of this analysis. Of course, the analysis itself is very important. I think one of the ways, and I'll let Mr. Lopez speak to this, but I think it's the state of Montana that is exploring the best mechanism for that analysis. And I think what they're looking at doing in Montana is actually having the university system perform that analysis in order to sort of control those costs. It's, again, hard to determine exactly what the cost of the analysis itself would be. It would depend to some extent, of course, on the scope of the regulation that's being analyzed. But I think Mr. Bott and Mr. Lopez may have some more detail to add to that. And I wanted to did want to touch briefly on Assemblywoman Considine's follow-up question about, do we need this bill, given we don't know to what extent it would trigger or to what extent it would be triggered. As I said in my opening remarks, there will be an inherent value along the way to start, requiring these independent analyses so that we can get a good grip on the cost of these regulations and determine if there is, in fact, a problem. I think it's really a less than ideal situation when so many of these things are being done in the dark, where there really is no analysis of what the cost of these regulations are going to be. But Mr. Bott, Mr. Lopez, if you want to speak to the issue of Assemblywoman Thomas's question.
Chairman Flores, to the Assemblywoman, through you, Marcos Lopez, Americans for Prosperity, Nevada, for the record. So in Montana, that's one of the main things that kind of came up was how do we handle the cost of this? Their approach is to partner up with the universities to actually engage in these studies, to engage in cost savings through the universities. And that's something that we can kind of explore in the same route. And going back also to this former Assemblywoman's question on the cost and this problem, this is about getting a complete picture, getting all the information relevant. And at the end of the day, if the legislative body agrees that, this is the right way, or maybe it needs to be done a little bit tighter or even more restrictive or less restrictive, that's just about getting more information and more transparency to your committee and to members of the legislature to be able to make better informed decisions.
Follow up, Chair.
Follow up, please.
Thank you, sir. So Assemblywoman Matthews, I would like a dollar amount, an estimate. I believe that the university, I'm assuming that you would have University Las Vegas and or Reno. Something is costing the universities for these analyses, and it sounds like it would be an extensive analysis, audits for what you are asking for. So I would like to know, we had not mentioned Montana, but since you mentioned Montana and you mentioned Wisconsin, somebody has a dollar amount. If you could please expound on that.
Yeah, what I'll do, thank Andy Matthews, District 37, Assemblyman, for the record. What I'd like to do is continue to work with stakeholders, look at some of the experiences from other states, and have to work with our staff here to get as precise as we can, regarding what the cost of those impact analyses might be. And as soon as I have that information, I'll be happy to share that with committee members. It is very, very important to know. And, one thing just to mention too, that because this is a concept that is, relatively new and taking shape, and, just one state where it's been implemented, a lot of this is sort of new territory, and we're all kind of working through the best ways to approach these things. And I'm also going to explore potential alternatives to the university system. I think that's a great way to go, but there may be other entities that may be well situated to provide some of these analyses. So we're working through a lot of the different possibilities here. The main goal, I think, and the key objective of all of this is, like Mr. Lopez said, greater transparency, to make sure that we're not doing these things in the dark, and that, when we're going to write new regulations, we do have an understanding of what that's going to be. Because a lot of times there will be tremendous costs to our economy down the road. And it may well be worth it, I would argue it would be, if there is an initial upfront cost to at least understand what that's going to be before we go too far down that road. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Next, we'll go to Assemblywoman Brown May.
Thank you, Chair Flores. Thank you, Assemblyman Matthews. I have just a couple of questions. I've had an opportunity over the years to work very closely with some of our self-advocates out of Wisconsin in particular, and it's my understanding that that legislative body meets all year long and functions very differently than we do in Nevada. And I just want to verify that that is in fact the truth. So what we're talking about is giving them an opportunity to consider this type of oversight. They're a body that's in session already and can immediately reply to that. So that's my first question. For me, these regulations would be relative to Medicaid and how Medicaid is administrated and regulated within the state, as the state often rolls out regulations. So that's Health and Human Services for me. And I'm curious to know if you see that as well. Now, those contracts and those regulations are always over $10 million. And it directly deals with the Health and Human Services as the population that we're here to serve, with a legislative body that meets every other year. For me, that's an issue of concern. So I'd like for you to, if you don't mind, just respond to that. And then what about contracts? Would this apply to contracts that the state would enter into as opposed to regulations? Thank you.
Andy Matthews, District 37, Assemblyman for the record. To your first point, yes, as I believe one of my co-presenters mentioned, this would oftentimes, involve, I believe, I would anticipate regulations involving Medicaid and HHS. I'll let Mr. Bott speak to your question on the Wisconsin legislature and the frequency with which they meet. My understanding is that they are an annual legislature, that they do meet annually. Unlike us, one way I think that would be beneficial to address that here in Nevada, and I believe that this is what they're doing in Montana, or the way they're looking at this in Montana, which is also a legislature that meets every other year. I think that they are looking at a provision, and I'll let Mr. Lopez correct me if I'm wrong, but they're looking at a provision through which a regulation that would come up in the off year, when the legislature is not in session. So it's not practical for the legislature to come into session all the time to review and vote for or against these regulations. Under what they're doing in Montana, the regulation would be allowed to take effect at the outset. And then what would happen is, when the legislature does come back into session, the legislature would then have to approve it. So the regulation would come with basically a sunset provision, and it would be allowed to temporarily take effect, subject to later approval from the legislature when they're back in session. And I think something like that, and I think that would be a good way to amend this or to add to this bill, would be to have a similar provision for here in Nevada. Mr. Lopez, correct me if I'm wrong on that, or feel free to add to that.
Carlos Lopez for the record. Yeah, so that is what they're looking at in Montana, because they also meet the same schedule that we do. So in particular, if a federal rule comes down and the agency has to comply with the federal rule, if there comes with money attached, then the REINS Act would not kick in Montana. If it does not come with money attached down from the feds, then it would go into effect with the sunset on the approval, and the REINS Act would kick in. And the legislature, when they get back into the regular session, would meet on that. And if at the end of the regular session there is no agreement or approval, then the sunset clause would kick in on that said regulation or rule.
And then Andy Matthews, District 37, Assemblyman for the record, and Assemblywoman Brown May, to your second question, I do not believe this would apply to contracts. I would defer to legal on as to whether or not that would fall under this definition of regulation, but I do not believe that as it's written that would apply to contracts.
Follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Follow-up.
So for me, this would be the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which would be a federal regulation that was handed down to the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. It was an unfunded federal mandate that requires transition services for high school students with individualized education plans, and is a 4-to-1 match out of the federal government. But it would be well over $10 million. So you're under what you've just presented, that even handed down in an off year when we have not met, you would expect the department to implement a new regulation and then come back and seek approval for a federal mandate? Am I understanding this?
Andy Matthews, District 37, Assemblyman, for the record. And again, Mr. Lopez, you can, because you've got more familiarity with how they're exploring this in the Montana example to deal with this. But my understanding would be, and again, this isn't in the current bill, but I think this is something that's worth exploring here, would be that if there's a federal regulation that's mandated that does come with funds, then this act would not kick in, and the agency could go ahead and implement the regulation. But if there is an unfunded mandate, it would be subject to the legislature having to go ahead and approve that. And the legislature may well go ahead and approve it. I think in a situation like that, the argument in favor of doing that, under that sort of situation like you described, Assemblywoman, would be extremely powerful, and would clearly probably be in the interest of the state to do that. So I want to be clear, this does not mean these regulations would not take effect. This simply means that when you're talking about these significant dollar amounts, the legislature should have a seat at the table and have a voice in that discussion. Thank you. Mr. Lopez, anything to add to that?
No, I think you pretty much summed it up perfectly. The way that they're exploring in Montana is if it comes down with federal money, then it would not kick in. If it does come with an unfunded mandate, then the legislature would have a say, and there's nothing in this bill to stop them and stop you guys from approving said regulation rule or putting input to either strengthen it or put it more in line with what you believe is the best interest for the state.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Thank you, Assemblyman Matthews. And I just want to leave with this one last comment, that there are often unfunded mandates that come down from the federal government that do draw a 4-to-1 match. That is a general fund expenditure that would be over $10 million, but would pull in well over $40 million. And so I just want to leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Next, we'll go to Assemblywoman Duran.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Assemblyman Matthews and Mr. Lopez and Mr. Botts for your presentation. So there's a couple of questions that I have. So has anyone in Nevada that we know of that has been hit with a $10 million regulation or fine or anything is my first question. And can you give me some examples how this regulations would impact the low-income communities?
Andy Matthews, District 37, for the record. So to your first question, that's part of the challenge I spoke to earlier, because the state has not tracked this data, because these analyses have not been done. It's very difficult to know, and we don't have that information on how many agencies, how many regulations would be subject to this. I think it's really important information for us to start collecting going forward, and that's part of what this would accomplish. To your second question, I think that one of the best ways to help our lower income communities is to identify and stop onerous regulations. Overregulation is so often, one of the great impediments to economic growth and job creation and opportunity. And this is a mechanism to make sure that we're not, putting up these barriers that would help contribute to that problem. And at the very least, if we are not seeing regulations proposed that would, trigger this, there would be that inherent value in starting to get information on what the cost of these regulations would be, so that lawmakers could, take it on themselves to start, removing regulations that are in place and that are found to be really prohibitive, when it comes to people getting access to a good job. And so often, some of the regulations we have in place, whether it's occupational licensing or something else, really do have a disproportionate negative impact on lower income citizens, because they really do end up serving as a barrier to entry into the workforce. And I think this should end up being extremely valuable in terms of really getting a good grip and more transparency into what our regulatory apparatus is, where some of the challenges may be, and making sure that we're not over-regulating to the point that we are making it difficult for people to be successful and to earn a good living here. Thank you.
Follow up, Chair.
Follow up, please.
But don't we already have regulations concerning basically for employment and stuff like that already that, you know, with the disparities, we have EEOC and stuff like that for people to file complaints on stuff like that. If it's, you know, trying to get the impacts of employment or any other type of disparate treatment, there's already places that people can go. I'm just trying to figure out what regulations are really impacting people without some of the state agencies we already have.
Andy Matthews, District 37, someone for the record. And yes, of course, yeah, there are lots of regulations that are already in place. And this isn't covered in this bill, but I think there'd be a lot of value in getting more of a grasp on what the impact of those regulations may be. This bill, would pertain to new regulations going forward, new proposed regulations, making sure we understand the economic impact, making sure that if the impact's going to be very significant, that we, the people's representatives, have a say in that. And I do, like I said, I think that it's important to know, because a lot of times these regulations, many of them make sense, of course, many of them are necessary and practical, but in a lot of cases they can serve as an impediment to economic prosperity and job growth. And we just want to have a better sense of what's going on. And again, in those significant cases, just making sure that you and I and others in this legislature have a chance to speak on behalf of our constituents on those questions. Thank you.
If I may kind of build on that, Chair, to the Assemblywoman Marcos Lopez, Americans for Prosperity. I mean, we know that there is an association of higher regulations with negative effects in terms of poverty, income inequality, lower entrepreneurship, higher consumer prices, and all that disproportionately affects low-income communities because they're spending more of their money that they might have less of on higher prices. It's harder for them to climb the economic ladder. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we always talk about occupational licensing reform, tackling the fact that we are the second most widely regulated, onerously regulated occupational licensing regimes in the country. And a lot of those are for lower income occupations or people trying to start off in a new career path. Even looking at this COVID crisis, one of the first things we did at the beginning of the crisis was ease healthcare regulations. So we had the ability to increase the supply of medical professionals in our state. There are real impacts that stand in the way of us being able to deliver quality services and quality goods in our state. And, sometimes it's kind of begging the question when we ask, what is this going to affect when we don't even have anything in place that they have to do these analyses in the first place.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Next, I'll go to Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Assemblymember Matthews, for bringing this forward. It's also nice talking with you, Mr. Lopez and Mr. Bott, about this information. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. And so I'm going to go directly to the bill and ask for a what if situation. I realize it's a what if situation. But if you look at, let's just say, section 1.1, and there is somebody who is utilizing regulations for, let's just say, hazardous materials, because based upon Mr. Lopez's exhibit that he entered, that seemed to be one of the higher regulations. Before the department can even bring people together to discuss based upon this, the department is supposed to figure out, not the department, an independent entity is supposed to figure out how much the possible regulation could cost. Am I understanding that correctly, or have I muddied the process?
Andy Matthews, District 37, Assemblyman for the record. Yeah, under this, before that regulation, the regulation could not simply be put into effect. You would have to have an analysis to determine the impact.
So follow up if I may, Mr. Chair.
Please follow.
Thank you. So just to make sure then, let's say that, again, we're using the hazardous material. Instead of being able to reach out to individuals who might be in the middle of being a small business that utilizes the hazardous materials, before being able to figure out what is realistic for that small business, the regulatory department must figure out how much it would cost. I'm getting caught up in the minutia of this, and I realize I am, but there's some really minute details that have a big impact on some of our smaller businesses.
Andy Matthews, District 37, Sullivan for the record. I see that Mr. Lopez is unmuted, so looks like maybe you have something to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Assemblyman. Chair, through you to the Assemblywoman. I don't think the intention is that before they progress on any rule, or if they're before they take input from the community, it's more of before the final product is kind of implemented, they have to do an economic study of it while they take input and maybe reach out to parties that might be affected. I think this is part of the process of the rulemaking. They have to do the economic study, so then we have the full information. And then before it goes into final effect, it has to come from the legislature, and the agency comes, they present and they explain what it will do, they make the case. And if they convince you that this is something that is needed and appropriate, we just move forward.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I'm having a problem with this. I'm not gonna lie. I think based upon my experiences before conducting a workshop, the workshops are not always with the regulations already figured out. Many times it's with people that are in the middle of items, and they're able to kind of have those discussions as to what is the best way to move forward when there's a regulation that is being triggered by a law. And so I just, that's one element that I have a bit of an issue with. I think another thing that is very concerning to me has already been brought up, but it is, how will the independent auditor be paid for? Well, let's just say that it's a Nevada system of higher ed, or even a K-12 school, a regulation, or one of our medicals, because again, based upon the exhibit that was brought forward, our medical facilities have many regulations. How would that independent auditor be paid? Would it be done through taxpayer money, or would it be done through the other entities?
Assemblyman Andy Matthews, District 37 for the record. Yeah, thank you for the question. As you noted, that's something that did come up earlier, and something that I think is really important to get more of a firm grip on. And as I said, one of the things about this concept is because it is, relatively new and not in place in a lot of places. I think this kind of feedback is extremely helpful as we craft this and work to get this in place and get it just right for our state. And I think that it will be an ongoing process. Mr. Bott, I don't know, some of these questions that are being asked, I'm assuming that these were considered in Wisconsin while this was being worked or talked through and analyzed there. I don't know if Mr. Bott, you could speak to Assemblywoman Anderson's questions and how those may have been considered or addressed in your state. Not to put you on the spot.
No, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity. A couple comments here. First off, the way that our act is crafted in Wisconsin, it is only triggered if there's a $10 million cost on the regulated community for a 2-year period. And so the act has no impact on the state implementing state or federal programs such as Medicaid. It would only again be impacted not by spending, not by implementing a program, but by creating a new regulation that will have a burden on the regulated community rather than the state or local government. I think that's an important approach, because you don't want to, in some ways, unintentionally strangle the implementation of necessary government services, and it's quite possible to do that if crafted appropriately. I think I've lost. Forgive me, I've lost track of the last question here. If you would like repeating, sorry.
Well, I think one thing also, I want to make sure this is clear. So it's 10 million over a 2-year period. So it's actually 5 million per year is a possibility. Is that accurate?
It could be.
It could be. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Assemblymember Matthews, as well as the others, have answered my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Next, we'll go to Madam Vice Chair Torres.
Thank you, Chair. Assemblyman Matthews, thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering if you could give some clarification. As I read the legislation right now, it requires approval from the entire legislative body. Is that correct?
Sorry, I had a challenge on muting myself. Andy Matthews, District 37, summoned for the record. As I read it, yes, and that was my intent. Yes.
Thank you for your response, and I appreciate the response, Assemblyman Matthews, but perhaps I'm a little bit more fiscally conservative, but I just find this a liberal use of our taxpayers' money. When I came up to the session, I left my community and I serve a predominantly low-income community. I work in a predominantly low-income community. And hardworking Nevada families have been hit hard by this pandemic. And I can't imagine us passing a piece of legislation that is going to be costly to Nevada taxpayers. I mean, I think about like this idea of having the entire legislature approve something like this. It either requires multiple special sessions, or as you mentioned, perhaps giving them the temporary ability for that to take effect. And that just seems costly to Nevada. And so I don't know that there's any way that this bill can be amended that will not be costly to hardworking Nevada families. And I just don't know how I'm going to get there on this legislation, quite honestly.
Andy Matthews, District 37, summoned for the record. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, for the question and the comment. Regulations themselves, I think it's worth remembering, are very costly, in terms of our economy. And yes, when you implement something like this, there is a cost to government. But I think in the interest of your term, I guess fiscal conservatism, I would say fiscal accountability, it's making sure that we know what the impact on our private citizens, our private economy, our job creators is going to be of these regulations, because there is a very, very significant cost to that as well. And given that the cost of an analysis on the front end would be a one-time thing, and these regulations, if put in place, would be permanent, so that we're having the cost of these regulations year after year. It becomes, I think, very obvious and very clear that the cost of those regulations over time would far exceed the initial cost to perform the analysis to put this into place. And we want to make sure that we're not putting an undue burden on our citizens. Again, especially like I and Mr. Lopez have both said already, the low-income Nevadans who are so often disproportionately affected by onerous regulations, and having a better grasp of what that impact is going to be, I think, is very, very important. So anyway, thank you for your question and your comment. Appreciate it.
And Vice Chair, I don't know if you had a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I just think, if we can't even provide examples of regulations or how often this type of thing would occur, we're being blindsided by a piece of legislation. If this legislation were to perhaps, have LCB look at regulations that were over $10 million, perhaps that's something we could entertain, but rather this is going to put in place something that's going to be a financial burden to Nevada taxpayers. And, at this time, in the midst of a pandemic, I just don't know how this is something we even have a dialogue about.
Next, we have Assemblywoman Martinez, please. Oh, excuse me, sorry. I skipped over Assemblyman Ellison. Assemblyman Ellison, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of my questions were answered, and got those good questions, good answers out of there. But one of the questions I've got, and you might already hit on this, but most of the agencies that's dealing with that kind of money, they have an audit every year. can't you use that? I mean, is something to base on what they've already done in their audits? You just review it?
All right.
That's to you,
Andy
Mr.
Matthews,
Matthews.
for the record. Yeah, didn't want to cut you off. These analyses would be specific to a particular regulation that is proposed before it takes effect, to understand what it's going to be proactively on the front end. So I think that would be a distinction there. So yeah, again, don't know if Mr. Lopez or Mr. Bott has anything to add to that.
I suppose I could add, in Wisconsin, again, this proposal applies only to prospective regulations, and it applies to regulations that will have a significant cost impact on the regulated community. So it doesn't have an impact on current agency spending or regulations. And so such an approach may not be applicable here. This is really looking at bringing more transparency to prospective regulations, getting a better understanding through either an internal economic impact analysis within an agency, which Wisconsin does, or in some rare instances, an independent review if the legislature deemed that an agency may not have conducted a thorough or appropriate review. And I think in those instances, it's a very wise investment if your state is faced with the potential for a rule that will have a cost impact in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars or more. The impact of such a regulation on tax revenues to the state is very likely to far exceed the de minimis cost of certainly an internal analysis, which should really be a part of any regulating, any administrative rule process, but also even an independent analysis.
Okay. And just for a follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Please follow up.
An audit of that magnitude of $10 million, that could be anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 per audit, depends on the size of it and the length of it. So that's the ones that I've run across in that size, and so it can be very costly. So I'd like to get the response back from Mr. Matthews and how that's going to be funded and where it comes from. And I know he doesn't have them answers right now, but it'd be something to bring back, or let us know by email or text. Thank you.
Certainly will. Andy Matthews, for the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Assemblywoman Martinez.
Thank you, Chair Flores. Vice Chair Torres pretty much hit on the same thing, the same questions that I had. I too feel like at this point, Nevadans, we can't afford to be spending money like this. And really, I feel like the companies that do the analysis, they're the ones who are going to be making out on this. And I'm not sure that I can come on board with this. But thank you, Vice Chair Torres. I really don't have a question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Assemblywoman. Next, we'll go to back to Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you, Chair Flores. Actually, I think my question had been asked earlier, but I will, I guess, take this opportunity if possible. Can you tell me the genesis of this bill? Because like I said, in doing my research, it looks like these bills have been going around in different states, and it started like a decade ago as a congressional bill. So can you tell me, to me, it doesn't seem like this was a Nevada created bill. So where did this idea or this bill actually start?
Andy Matthews, District 37, Sullivan, for the record. The history, my understanding of it, I'm pretty clear on this, but the others can jump in if I'm wrong, is I think the genesis of this was, I believe, a federal piece of legislation called the REINS Act, again, with a nod toward the idea of reining in executive branch agencies. And over time, one state in particular, Wisconsin, decided to adopt this concept for the state level. And I believe at the federal level, the proposed threshold was regulation for $100 million. And obviously with state economies being much smaller, regulations being not as far reaching, Wisconsin adopted the concept at the state level with a $10 million threshold. And I believe that remains the only state that actually has this in law. And as Mr. Bott said, it took effect just a few years ago. And so, yeah, this is an example of looking at what's being done elsewhere and seeing something that looks like a good idea and something that could work for our state and trying to adopt that. Or just like we do with a lot of different bills and ideas. We'll look at an idea from another state and see that something looks like it would be effective here and try to adapt that for our own state. And as Mr. Lopez said, Montana is another state that is in the process, I think, of advancing legislation to implement this. And I think the state of Florida is also giving this some consideration, although I'm not sure exactly where they are in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman Matthews. I appreciate that answer. It just from my perspective, it feels like this is something we're trying to shoehorn in to the state of Nevada without having any data to show that it's necessary, but it coming with all those costs of the analysis and everything that would have to be done. If someone thought, okay, if I add all this up, it's potentially $10 million, then we have to lay out all of this money. And without data to show that, and without this kind of percolating up through Nevada, that's kind of my issue with this bill. It's just sort of that excess taxpayer money that we may or may not need to spend. Thank you, though.
Thank you.
Thank you, members, for the questions. I am looking through the chat. I don't believe we have any additional questions. However, if I accidentally skipped over anybody, please unmute yourself at this time. Seeing none, I am now looking through those of you that are joining us virtually to ensure that none of you were hoping to speak on this particular bill.
Chair, this is Assemblyman Matthews. I believe that Daniel Honshu from the Nevada Policy Research Institute intended to provide some testimony. I don't know, and I believe he has joined us via Zoom. I don't know if you'd like him to do so now or wait until we get to that portion.
No, perfect. We can have him join us now, and we'll open it up for those wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 340.
Thank you, Chair Flores, Vice Chair Torres. For the record, Daniel Honcharu on behalf of the Nevada Policy Research Institute. NPRI strongly supports AB 340 and urges each member of this committee to do the same. This bill, from a taxpayer's perspective, is desperately needed. The status quo suffers from a lack of legislative oversight regarding some of our state's most costly expenditures. Assemblyman Matthews' proposal seeks to remedy this by prohibiting state agencies from implementing the most costly of these measures unilaterally, essentially injecting a legislative and gubernatorial check against an ever-expanding administrative state. By requiring both the legislatures and the governor's explicit authorization of any regulatory appropriation in excess of $10 million, this bill will curb the rate at which the administrative state has grown in recent years and promote cost-efficient solutions. While unfortunately the federally proposed REINS Act, after which AB 340 is modeled, has not been enacted, the state of Wisconsin has implemented its own REINS Act in 2017. In other words, this concept is neither novel nor untested. Government has a fundamental obligation to its taxpayers to limit wasteful and unaccountable spending wherever possible. AB 340 simply provides an appropriate tool for that purpose. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us. Again, I am looking through our signed in folk to ensure that none of you were hoping to testify in support. I don't believe we have anybody else. So at this time, broadcast will go to those on the phone line wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 340.
To testify in support of Assembly Bill 340, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 116, Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Alexis Motorex, Alexis Motarex, with the Nevada Chapter Associated General Contractors, representing the commercial construction industry in Northern Nevada. We are here in support of AB 340. As an industry that is heavily regulated, we believe it is solid public policy to have a better understanding of the economic impact regulations will have on private industry and government agencies. Overburdensome regulations can be costly to business owners, which directly impacts their ability to grow and hire employees. A thoughtful analysis on the cost of implementation, or possibly where savings may be realized, would be beneficial to both governmental agencies and private industry. We appreciate Assemblyman Matthews bringing this forward.
And thank you for joining us. Next caller wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 340.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 859. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning. This is Janine Hansen, State President of Nevada Families for Freedom, JANINEHANSEN. We support AB 340. This is a very reasonable measure which requires administrative agencies before implementing the proposed regulation to determine the economic impact not only on the agency, taxpayers, but also on those citizens who will be subject to the regulation. This bill will save Nevada families money. In the Nevada Constitution, Article 4, Section 19, which outlines the duties and powers of the legislature, it states, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law." That portion of the Constitution clearly places the power of expenditures on the legislature, not on unelected administrative agencies. Therefore, it is only appropriate the cost of regulations exceeding $10 million be reviewed before implementation by the governor who submits the budget and the legislature which approves them. The high cost of government regulations implemented by unelected government agencies are part of the hidden taxes which drive up the cost of doing business and therefore drive up costs to all consumers. Regulations are one of the main drivers of these hidden taxes. According to the Institute for Policy Innovation in the United States, the total U.S. tax burden, including federal, state, and local taxes and hidden taxes, is equal to 56% of annual personal consumption spending. In other words, taxes consume 56% of all the average person spends. There are many hidden taxes. Regulations are a major part. My brother had a roofing company in Sparks. He would tell people if the roof would cost $10,000, that half of that was in taxes, fees, and regulations. It is good policy that unelected administrative agencies should be subject to the oversight of the governor and legislature in order to save taxpayer money. Support AB 340. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this morning. We'll continue with support on Assembly Bill 340.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 166. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Barry, excuse me, Barry Duncan, BARRYDUNCAN. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Barry Duncan on behalf of the Nevada Taxpayers Association. We call in support of AB 340 and the concept of conducting economic analysis on regulations. Should the committee opt to move the bill forward, we stand prepared to work with the sponsor, the committee members, and other stakeholders on any amendments that may be considered for the legislation. Thank you for your time and consideration.
And thank you for joining us this morning. We'll continue on with the next caller in support of Assembly Bill 340.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 105. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Chairman and Committee. My name is Lynn Chapman. I'm the State Treasurer of the Independent American Party, LYNNCHAPMAN. We are in support of AB 340. Taxpayers should expect accountability and responsibility in their government, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to always happen. We hear the words transparency in government a lot, but I don't think we really see it as much as we hear of it. People are becoming more wary of regulations. After all, we are the ones who are greatly impacted by the regulations themselves. Regulations should be scrutinized closely, especially when it concerns large amounts of money attached to them. Citizens need accountability, responsibility, and transparency, and that should not be too much to expect from our government. This bill is a reasonable beginning to that end. Please vote yes on SB 340. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll continue with support on Assembly Bill 340.
Caller with the last three digits of 706. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Hello, good morning. My name is Eddie Diaz, E-D-D-I-E-D-I-A-Z. I'm calling in support of SB 340. Taxes, fees, and regulations is what hurts the citizens the most. And like many of you said, especially in a pandemic. So this will bring more accountability to our state, to our government. So please support SB 340. Thank you.
And thank you. Next caller in support of Assembly Bill 340.
Caller with the last three digits of 643. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you. Wiz Rizard, W-I-Z-R-O-U-Z-A-R-D, calling on behalf of Americans for Prosperity Nevada as the Director of Grassroots Operations. I ask to support AB 340. There's a quote saying, "Seeing is believing." And as much as everybody has shared here, transparency is key, and making sure that government is operating rightfully to and for the people. And there's no better way to make sure of that than to support AB 340 and making sure that anything above $10 million is assessed diligently so that we, the taxpayers, the constituents, are able to see what it is our government is spending so we can direct to our lawmakers what are the concerns within those spendings. So I ask you all to support AB 340. And remember, seeing is believing. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Next caller in support of Assembly Bill 340.
Caller with the last three digits of 821. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin. Caller with the last three digits of 821. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin. To testify in support of Assembly Bill 340, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no callers in support at this time.
Thank you. At this time, we'll invite those wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 340.
To testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 340, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits of 227. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Hi, this is Luis Vega. I'm calling on behalf of Concerned Veterans for America. And I'm actually calling in support of the RAINS Act. I just believe this is not just going to help veterans, but overall, it's a tide that lifts all boats in regards to giving the voters more say. This reform is forward-looking. It not only applies, it only applies to new proposals. So this gives lawmakers the opportunity to prevent the implementation of overly burdensome regulations. This is an important check that is often virtually unrestrained power of the administrative branch to implement laws at their discretion. This is giving a greater say to the people, and Concerned Veterans for America greatly supports it, and I urge you to support it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to testimony in opposition to Assembly Bill 340.
To testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 340, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no callers in opposition at this time.
Thank you. At this time, we'll invite those wishing to testify in the neutral position.
To testify in the neutral position for Assembly Bill 340, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no callers in the neutral position at this time.
Thank you. Assemblyman Matthews, any closing remarks you may have?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and I'll be very, very brief. And I appreciate all the time allotted to this by you and the committee this morning. Just like to mention in closing that regulations can and often do have a profound impact on our communities, including our businesses, our job creators, and our workers. In many cases, those regulations may well be justified. But before we put them in place, it's important that we first take the steps to understand what precisely that impact will be. When the impact is especially significant, the people of our state deserve to have a voice in that discussion through their elected legislators. That's what AB 340 seeks to accomplish, and I respectfully ask your support of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. We'll close the hearing on Assembly Bill 340. And I see Assemblyman Watts has joined us, and we'll now open the hearing on Assembly Bill 378.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, I am Howard Watts, representing Assembly District 15 in Clark County, and I'm glad to present Assembly Bill 378 for your consideration today on behalf of the hardworking Committee on Natural Resources. With the Chair's indulgence, I'll provide brief background for the measure before stepping through the sections of the bill, after which I'll stand for any questions that the committee may have. I also want to just bring to the committee's awareness, I was having conversations with some of the interested parties on this and compiled a conceptual amendment, which I sent to all the members late last night. So I will be referencing that as well. And apologies for not getting it out sooner. To understand Assembly Bill 378, we first have to provide a little bit of context about the Sagebrush Rebellion. This was a movement that started in the 1970s in the Western United States that objected to the federal management of our public lands and sought significant mass-scale transfers of management authority, if not an outright transfer of ownership to state and local governments. As many, if not all of you are aware, most of the lands in Nevada are owned by the people of the United States and managed by federal agencies, with the Bureau of Land Management holding the most jurisdiction. While the BLM has operated under a doctrine of multiple use since 1976, balancing energy development, mining, grazing, recreation, and the preservation of historic and cultural resources for future generations, their decisions in particular have been subject to critique by every individual constituency for not providing the proper attention to their interests. As wilderness and endangered species designations, along with changing economies, impacted local industries and communities, calls grew across the West for more local control and local ownership. Nevada has had its share of prominent sagebrush rebels and public lands conflicts. Starting in 1979, these efforts moved into the legislative arena with an effort by then Assemblyman Rhodes, which successfully added a variety of policies that sought to establish state veto power over federal management actions, asserted a state claim to vast swaths of public land, and set up processes to manage the lands that would soon be transferred into the state's hands. As many of us know, that vision never came to pass, and much of the resulting statutory language today in Chapter 321 of NRS is frankly unconstitutional. As a result, Assembly Bill 378 seeks to remove these unused and inappropriate statutes and establish state and local governments under our law as partners in the collaborative management of our public lands. In conversations with others, I've understood that a few of these proposed changes swing a little too far in the opposite direction. And after talking with our Division of State Lands and representatives from Eureka County, I've proposed an amendment that I'll walk you through. Eureka County has also submitted a letter of opposition and a proposed amendment. I did not accept all of their proposed changes, but I do appreciate their feedback and will remain in conversation to make sure that we get this to a balanced, reasonable place. First, I think it's appropriate to start with what's not in the bill. I direct your attention to Section 14, which notes the sections of statute that are being repealed. The first legislative declaration signals the intent of the state to seek the acquisition of any lands managed by the federal government in the state. Chapter 321.596 through 599 declares federal management of public lands a hardship, gives the state, claims to give the state management authority over these lands, and creates the Board of Review as a regulatory and appeals body for these decisions. A table of boards and commissions that's prepared and provided for the Sunset Committee of the legislature indicates that no recent meetings have been held of the Board of Review, and notes that in 2015, LCB Legal questioned the constitutionality of these statutes. NRS 321.601 created a public land trust fund to handle payments in taxes following a massive land transfer from the federal government. Since that didn't happen, this section has never become effective since its passage decades ago. 321.735 gives the Division of Lands the ability to represent state and local interests on issues involving federal lands, roles that I feel are best delegated out by our governor and by our local governments. And 321.736 unconstitutionally requires the federal government to get state consent for its land management decisions. Now, returning to the top of the bill and walking through it, Section 1 seeks to deprioritize disposal of state trust lands, making it one of many management options. The amendment that I have provided clarifies this by adding the word disposal back in, but not having selection and disposal be the only pieces of language, including management as well. Sections 2 and 3 of the bill eliminate language related to the designation of areas of critical environmental concern. These state ACECs are a separate designation from those who are familiar with federal areas of critical environmental concern, and this statute hasn't been used by the state since enactment. However, in conversations with stakeholders, there is interest in putting this authority to use. So my proposed amendment leaves this language in place. It undoes the changes that are proposed in the original bill. Section 3 also eliminates a definition of public lands that basically by process of elimination only means BLM lands. Section 5 is simplifying language regarding the state's technical assistance to local governments. And my proposed amendment changes the shall to may, because this work is dependent upon available resources. So as amended, it provides broad statutory authority for the Division of State Lands to provide technical assistance requested by local governments depending on available resources. Section 6 deletes language promoting the increased local management of public lands. Section 7 removes the requirement that the state include local comments in any comments it makes to the federal government, though it would not be precluded from doing so. It would just become optional. Section 8 removes language prioritizing the acquisition of federally managed lands and eliminates language around planning that I had originally interpreted as dictating federal land use plans. However, my proposed amendment restores this language in this and other sections, since in conversations with Eureka County, it was determined that local governments can indeed submit local land use plans to support and inform collaborative management outcomes under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and other federal processes. Section 10 removes another unconstitutional provision requiring the federal government to seek consent to manage lands in the state. And Section 13 adds the previously deleted definition of public lands, i.e. BLM lands, to Chapter 487, where it is referenced for statutes related to abandoned vehicles. But I am going to do some additional research and see if that definition should be modified further. In summary, Assembly Bill 378 streamlines our state statutes by removing language that is unconstitutional and eliminating accounts and bodies that have never been utilized. In doing so, it promotes the responsible and collaborative management of public lands in our great state. I ask for your support, and with that, I conclude my presentation and will take any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Assemblyman, and appreciate you walking us through the sections to help us grasp what's happening. Members, at this time, we'll open it up for questions. I am now looking through the chat.
I just got one question, Mr. Chair.
Please, Assemblyman Ellison.
Mr. Chair, born and raised in rural Nevada all my life, and this is probably the worst bill I ever seen of a taking. And I'm hoping that the sponsors of this bill will take a look at it. But this is a bill that's crossed the line, and I've been involved and remember when the Sagebrush Rebellion was there. Also remember when the taking in South Canyon Road. So this takes the rights of the people totally out of this and gives total control. And I don't know, I'm hoping I can get with Mr. Watson, do some amendments, but this has crossed the line. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Watts, I don't know if you have any responses to his comments regarding a taking.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Assemblyman Ellison. Howard Watts for the record. I just say that I respectfully disagree. This is not takings. This is clarifying existing authority where the federal government manages our public lands. It is not seeking to reduce the role of local feedback and participation in those processes that occurs to this day. So if Assemblyman Ellison has specific recommendations, as Eureka County did, and which I incorporated in the proposed conceptual amendment, I'm more than interested in seeing those. However, I just will note that when Nevada entered statehood, title to most of these lands was transferred to the federal government for management for future generations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Watts.
Thank you both. Next, we'll go to Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Assemblymember Watts, for bringing forward the bill. I have two questions. The first is on Section 5. The language is being removed for Section 5.2. Does this mean that these activities will no longer be will no longer be a consideration of the state land use planning agency? Or does this mean that it will be transferred over to a different agency to or entity to oversee these items? And that's my first question. I've got a second one. It's in a different section.
Thank you very much for the question, Assemblywoman Anderson. Howard Watts for the record. Essentially, under the proposed conceptual amendment, Section 5, subsection 2 will read, the state land use planning agency may provide technical assistance to a county or city in areas where such assistance is requested. This statute has been modified. There was a different lists of priority activities, and those have been adjusted as the resources for the Division of State Lands have changed. Especially as I was looking at modifying this around the areas of critical environmental concern language, what we did was just simplify this. So instead of designating in statute particular priorities, we maintain the authority for the Division of State Lands, which is our planning agency, to provide technical assistance to local governments in any areas where that assistance is requested, as long as they have the resources to do so. So the intent is really to streamline on this section, not to create a functional change.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure about that. Thank you for that answer. And then section 7, wait, let me share it with section 7. So sorry. Oh, no, section 7, section 8, excuse me. I don't know how to use my numbers, I guess. Section 8, subsection 2, is that the same reasoning for removing the language of considering these items? Is that the same reasoning, was just to try to streamline it, or is it addressed in other statute or codes?
Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman Anderson. For the record, Howard Watts. The reason for addressing the language in subsection 2 of section 8 was that in preparing the plans or statements of policy, the State Land Use Planning Authority or agency was required to identify land suitable for acquisition. Again, we're taking that out, so it's not required. The statute will be silent. If the agency wishes to do so, they may. We are keeping the final element of that subsection in the proposed amendment, which is that those plans must not include matters concerning zoning or the division of land and must be consistent with local plans to ensure that there's not conflict between what the state land use planning agency is putting forward and local plans.
Thank you so much for that clarification, because there's no way I would have been able to make the connection of how this was allowing the county plans to take precedence over the state land use plan. So thank you very much for that clarification. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Next, we'll go to Assemblywoman Dickman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity. And thank you, Assemblyman Watts. My question is just about, you talked about, was it section 321 is unconstitutional? Is it the Nevada's constitution that is unconstitutional, or federally? Could you just expand a little bit on that and maybe explain why it's unconstitutional?
Certainly. Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman Dickman. For the record, Howard Watts. I was referring to specific sections of statute within Chapter 321 of the Nevada Revised Statutes. In particular, I referenced in my remarks the repealed sections, particularly sections 596 through sections 596 through 599 of Chapter 321, which established the Board of Review and essentially create statutes dictating to the federal government how management actions would occur and requiring consent from the state for any federal land management activity to occur. That is unconstitutional because those lands are held by the people of the United States and managed by the federal government, we do not have the constitutional authority to preempt all of their laws and land management processes. Now, under existing setups, there are multiple ways where local and state entities can participate in the land planning development process, but we do not have final say, veto power, the ability to give consent for any decision that the federal government makes on its land use decisions. So we essentially have a role of providing feedback, providing advice, and then in certain areas we do have some leeway, but we do not get a blanket say over how to manage lands that are not owned by state or local governments. And so those are the provisions that are unconstitutional and are being proposed for removal under this bill.
And so who determined they were unconstitutional? Our legal department?
Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman Dickman. Howard Watts for the record. Yes, as I noted before, in a table of boards and commissions provided to the Sunset Committee of the Legislature, it was noted that as far back as 2015, CB Legal questioned the constitutionality of these statutes, which essentially tried to preempt federal land management policies.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Members, any additional questions? I don't believe I see any additional questions, but at this time, please feel free to unmute yourself. Seeing none, at this time, I'd like to invite those wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 378. Broadcast, if we could please go to the phone lines.
To testify in support of Assembly Bill 378, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 120, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Lisa Ortega, Lisaortega. Good morning, Chair Flores and members of the committee. Please accept this testimony of support for AB 378. My name is Lisa Ortega, volunteer member of the Sierra Club's Legislative Committee, Southern Nevada Board ExCom member. On behalf of the Sierra Club and our more than 40,000 members and supporters, I'm speaking in support of AB 378. One of the best things about Nevada is our wealth of public lands managed on behalf of the public by agencies like BLM, the Forest Service, and others. We and many others don't want that to change. We disagree strongly with the language this bill targets to remove from law. This bill will eliminate existing unconstitutional and anti-public land provisions in law and better align the roles and responsibilities of the Division of State Lands. There have been numerous efforts in the past to seize federal lands and transfer ownership to the state or local government, which would have created negative impacts on conservation and public access. Nevadans are lucky to have access to public lands. The state does not have the financial resources to effectively manage these lands, and any large-scale transfer will result in more privatization of these public resources. Thanks for your time, hard work, and dedication to the citizens of Nevada, and we hope you'll vote in favor of AB 378. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Next caller wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 378.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 732, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Hello, my name is Kyle Davis. That's Kyledavis. And I'm here today on behalf of the Nevada Conservation League. The Nevada Conservation League is in support of AB 378. The bill removes several outdated and unconstitutional sections of state law relating to public lands. Nevadans overwhelmingly support our public lands and want to see them kept open to the public and conserved for future generations. In the past, our state has attempted to seize federal public lands and transfer ownership to the state. The simple fact is that Nevada does not have the money or the expertise to manage these lands, and the ultimate outcome would have been to either bankrupt the state or sell these lands into private hands. This bill will update our state law and remove language that has proven to have no legal basis. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Next caller wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 378.
Caller, with the last three digits of 222, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Hello, my name is Russell Coleman. That is spelled R-U-S-S-E-L-L. Last name is K-U-H-L-M-A-N. I'm here today to represent the Nevada Wildlife Federation in support of AB 378. This bill cleans up a lot of unnecessary and unconstitutional language that is currently in Nevada, and it has been shown time and time again that states do not have the financial or the human personnel capacity to manage all of the land in Nevada if a federal transfer were to happen. And that is why the Nevada Wildlife Federation is in support of AB 378. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Next caller wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 378.
Testify in support of Assembly Bill 378. Please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no more callers in support at this time.
Thank you. At this time, I'll invite those wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 378.
To testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 378, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last three digits of 010, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you. I'm Jake Tibbetts. That's J-A-K-E-T-I-B-B-I-T-T-S. And I'm the Eureka County Natural Resources Manager representing Eureka County. So Chairman Flores and members of the Assembly Government Affairs Committee, thank you for the opportunity to share our view on AB 378. Eureka County opposes AB 378 as written. We've provided more detailed written testimony that's on Nellis. We do appreciate the discussions with the sponsor, Assemblyman Watts, and the conceptual amendment put forward addresses many of our concerns. I also want to point out that I'm the current chairman of the State Land Use Planning Advisory Council, or SLUPAC, and I'm not speaking on behalf of SLUPAC today, but I do have some insights related to some of the issues of this bill by being a member on SLUPAC for many years. While we understand the angst many have in the current statutory language related to the state policy on public lands, it is crucial to retain certain provisions being proposed for change or removal. We've included a potential amendment in our written testimony. The amendment is intended to restore the crucial elements, the related role of the State Land Use Planning Agency, related to assistance to counties and public land use and management. It's also meant to honor the intent to shift from the current focus of transfer and control over public lands by amending to instead endorse state and county coordination and engagement on public land use planning, management, and administration. As the state with the largest federal land holding in the U.S., it's crucial that the state continue to have strong policy in place to ensure counties' voice and local communities' and voice in public land use planning and management are not diminished. Current federal law and regulation require federal land management agencies to coordinate their planning and management activities with the state, local, and tribal communities and governments, and to reach consistency with state and local plans and policies to the maximum extent possible. These coordination and consistency requirements are absolutely imperative to providing what I call a healthy tension and balance that gives the necessary recognition, consideration, and incorporation of state and local interests. The legislature should ensure that Nevada law has policy in place recognizing this. We look forward to continuing to find common ground on AB 378 with the sponsors and other interested parties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you. Next caller wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 378.
Caller with the last three digits of 859. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning. This is Janine Hansen, State President of Nevada Families for Freedom. We oppose AB 340. The battle to obtain control of Nevada's land by Nevada has been going on for decades. I participated in the Sagebrush Rebellion. This blows up the Sagebrush Rebellion. The control of Nevada's lands by the federal government is unconstitutional. In Article 1, Section 7, Clause 17 of the U.S. Constitution, it states, Congress shall exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenal, dockyards, and other needful buildings, not to control the whole state of Nevada, 87%. Nevada has an extraordinary burden of more than 87% of our land controlled by the feds. No state east of the Mississippi has more than 4% controlled by the feds. Why? Because here they're doing it unconstitutionally. Federal management of Nevada's lands has been a disaster. Wildfires have destroyed habitat and grasslands by the millions of acres. This is so apparent if one lives in the rural counties. Near my home in rural Elko, we have been threatened by wildfires repeatedly in the last 15 years since I've been there. Fires coming within a mile of my home. The feds ignore local people and their representatives. The county commissioners, when the BLM and Forest Service were planning to close many roads which had been open in Elko County for over 100 years, the feds listened to the objections of the county and the people and then did exactly what they wanted. They completely ignored the concerns of the people. They don't care what we think. They don't care what our needs are. They don't care about the need to use some of the resources of our own state. In Elko County, we tried to participate. They don't want to cooperate with us. It's absurd to assume they do if you've never been a part of this. We object to this bill as destroying our heritage of the Sagebrush Rebellion and destroying the statement that Nevada should have our lands back, not controlled by the federal government. It needs to go according to the Constitution, not according to this recent interpretation, which steals the control of Nevada land from Nevadans. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe I got a message. Assemblywoman Black, did you have a question?
No, I didn't, Chair. Thank you, though.
Oh, thank you, Assemblywoman. And thank you. We'll go to the next caller wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 378.
Caller with the last three digits of 929. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Colby Prout, Colby Prout. I'm the Natural Resources Manager for the Nevada Association of Counties. And NACO's members are all 17 of Nevada's counties. First, NACO would like to thank Assemblyman Watts for his work on this bill and taking the time to meet with us and hear concerns, and as well as his willingness to put forward a conceptual amendment, which we appreciate looking over and continuing to work on with him. However, we are testifying in opposition of this bill as it's currently written. The State Land Use Planning Agency has proved important for many of Nevada's counties, particularly those without the resources to themselves create land use plans, specifically because certain federal laws, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, better known as NEPA, or the Federal Land Management Policy Act, better known as FLPMA, require consistency or consideration of county land use plans. Having comprehensive and updated versions of these plans give counties a seat at the table and a voice on federal actions that will have a significant impact on them. To that end, requiring the State Land Use Planning Agency to include comments of the affected counties in their own comments, submitted to the federal government encourages cooperation and coordination through all levels of the planning and regulatory process. Because so much of Nevada's lands is managed by the federal government, in some counties over 90%, this coordination and cooperation is oftentimes the most the county can hope for. Going forward, we hope that SLUPA's role in advancing county plans and priorities forward can be retained and continue to provide support that's become so important to so many of Nevada's counties. Again, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the sponsor for working with us going forward on the balanced approach to this bill.
And thank you. We'll go to the next caller wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 378.
Chair, there are no more callers in opposition at this time.
Thank you. At this time, we'll invite those wishing to testify in the neutral position for Assembly Bill 378.
To testify in the neutral position for Assembly Bill 378, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 956, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Chairman Flores and committee members. I am Charlie Donahue, Donohue, and I serve as the administrator of the Division of State Lands. The Division of State Lands is neutral on Assembly Bill 378. However, we are concerned that the bill, as currently worded, could result in some fiscal impacts and unintended negative policy consequences. As background, the Division of State Lands serves as the real estate agent for other state agencies, with the exception of NDOT, the legislature, and the system of higher education. We secure lands that agencies need to carry out their mission, and conversely, dispose lands when they are no longer needed by the agency or the state. A recent example is when the Nevada Division of Forestry shifted from an all-risk program to a more focused wildland fire protection program. This shift, which was supported by the legislature, required the disposal and transfer of a number of NDF fire stations from the state to local governments to fold into their programs. This is not a unique example, as over the years, the state has transferred properties originally acquired from the federal government to local governments in order to most efficiently serve the public. As such, we are concerned that striking the word dispose at the very beginning of the bill removes a necessary and essential tool for a land office. We are also concerned about the proposed language under Section 5 stating that the State Land Use Planning Agency, an agency of one within the Division of State Lands, shall provide technical assistance to a county or city in areas when assistance is requested. Requiring the agency to provide planning assistance whenever requested is beyond the agency's staffing and budget capacity and will require an additional staff person with the appropriate operating budget. NDSL has assembled and provided the information to LCB fiscal staff, and I believe the approximate dollar value is $143,000 per year. My final comment has to do with the elimination of SLUPAC to provide recommendations regarding areas of critical environmental concern designations. Over the past 2 years, the agency has worked with State Land Use Planning Advisory Council members to refine the process of designating a state ACEC, and this committee recently heard that bill outlining some of those changes in AB 52. The agency has identified 2 state properties worthy of that designation and the additional protection it may afford. As I testified during that hearing, I believe the council has both the technical expertise and political wherewithal to evaluate a proposal before them, provide for public participation through noticing and workshops, and make a final recommendation to the governor. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize Assemblyman Watt's opening comments regarding his conceptual amendment, and I appreciate his time yesterday to discuss this bill. I would be more than willing to work with the Assemblyman and his staff on the conceptual amendments he discussed. Thank you, Chair Flores and committee members. I would be happy to answer any of your questions or other committee members might have. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us this morning. I am now checking the chat. Members, any questions that may be directed in his direction? I don't see any. Thank you again. We'll go to the next caller wishing to testify in the neutral position.
Chair, there are no more callers in the neutral position at this time.
Thank you. At this time, we'll go back to Assemblyman Watts. Any closing remarks you may have?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Again, I want to appreciate the comments that were provided in opposition and neutral. I know that we had those conversations late and got this amendment put together late. We're kind of at that point in session where things are moving quickly. So look forward to making sure that everyone has the opportunity to review that and provide feedback. My understanding is that the contents of that proposed amendment, including adding the word disposal back into section 1, changing the shall to may in section 5, and restoring the reference to plans throughout the bill, address most of, if not all of, the substantial concerns about the bill and maintain state and local governments' ability to participate in collaborative land management planning with the federal government. If any additional adjustments are needed, I look forward to working those out and bringing them back to the committee for consideration in a work session. One last thing I'd add in closing to address some of the questions and remarks that have been made about what is and is not constitutional is the ordinance of the Nevada Constitution, our first and founding document. The third item listed in that ordinance is that the people inhabiting said territory do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within said territory, and that the same shall be and remain at the sole and entire disposition of the United States, and that lands belonging to citizens of the United States residing without the said state shall never be taxed higher than the land belonging to the residents thereof, and so on. As we entered the Union, we got rid of our claim to unappropriated lands in this state, and they became public lands managed for all of us with a multiple use doctrine for future generations. This bill ensures that our statutes line up with the Nevada and U.S. constitutions, and I urge your support for AB 378 as amended. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
And thank you, Assemblyman, for that presentation. I'm sure that you will work with the opposition and continue to answer some of the concerns they've raised. And I encourage the opposition to reach out to them, and I'm sure that you all could have a roundtable. So thank you. At this time, I'll go ahead and close out the hearing on Assembly Bill 378. And next, we'll go to Assembly Bill 249. Assemblywoman Jauregui, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chair Flores, Vice Chair Torres, and members of Government Affairs Committee. It's so nice to be back with you guys, in front of you guys, to present a bill. For the record, I'm Assemblywoman Sandra Jauregui, proudly presenting Assembly District 41, and I'm here today to present Assembly Bill 249 for your consideration. In 2019, I worked on a bill with the very same people at this virtual table here with me today. Our mission in 2019 was creating a safer work environment on construction sites. We were successful in passing AB 290, which created the OSHA registry to help combat the growing problem of fraudulent OSHA car. We are here before this same committee again, tackling a new and growing problem on construction sites, one less tangible, the problem of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Those in the construction industry are uniquely susceptible to heat-related injuries. The work comes with inherent risk, which are amplified by exposure to direct sunlight during the hottest months of the year. Between 1992 and 2016, 285 construction workers died from heat-related causes, and more than a third of all U.S. occupational deaths are from heat exposure. These figures come from the American Journal on Industrial Medicine, in a study that examined heat-related deaths published in July 2019. The study also noted that 78% of heat-related deaths in construction industry occurred during June, July, and August. Non-fatal heat injuries are far more prevalent. A study conducted in North Carolina showed heat-related injuries as the most common cause for an occupational ER visit. Injuries from heat exhaustion or heat stroke can result from cognitive impairment, dizziness, sweaty and slippery hands, slowed response time, muscle fatigue and cramping, nausea or vomiting, and clouded eyewear that blocks vision. The risks are obvious when these individuals are working with hammers, power saws, nail guns, welding and propane torches, and doing so suspended several stories in the air or on the roof of a home. While everyone is affected, cement masons are most at risk. They are 10 times more likely to die than the average construction worker, followed by roofers, who are 7 times more likely to die than the average construction worker. According to the federal agency, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, one of the most effective ways to combat this is to schedule higher risk jobs for cooler parts of the day. And that is exactly what AB 249 aims to do. With your permission, Chair, I would now like to walk the members through the bill. You should have all received the proposed amendment on Nellis, where I replaced the entire bill with this short new language indicating that a common interest community must not restrict the hours that construction work may begin during the months of May through September, other than those hours which construction work may begin pursuant to a zoning ordinance adopted by a governing body of the county or city. So if a city start time is 7 a.m., then a CIC must allow work in their community to begin at the same time. This bill is just the start of a conversation that I look forward to having during the interim to address this issue. Other cities and counties and other states with similar weather have already recognized this problem and passed local ordinances allowing for 5 a.m. start times during the extremely hot summer months. Chair, with your permission, I would now like to turn it over to Victoria Carrion with the Division of Industrial Relations OSHA Department to speak about the issue and growing number of complaints that their office is receiving, followed by Kelly Gaines, the president of the Nevada Subcontractors Association. Ms. Carrion, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hello, members of the committee, Madam Chair. Victoria Carrion for the record. I'm the administrator of the Division of Industrial Relations, and we're happy to be here today to help present AB 249. Our agency does handle all aspects of worker safety, and heat stress has been a major issue of our concern. And we are engaged in doing regulations related to heat stress that I think are a good complement to this bill. So Assemblywoman Jauregui has aptly stated some of the health dangers of heat stress. I did want to also share with you some of the data that we have here in Nevada related to heat stress. So in terms of workers' compensation claims, there's an average of about 73 per year related to heat stress. And I've provided this data in our written testimony that is available for you on Nellis. In addition, our Nevada OSHA agency receives complaints from employees related to heat stress, and we've had about 61 average per year in Southern Nevada and about 8 average per year in Northern Nevada. And obviously there's more in Southern Nevada due to the high levels of heat in the summer. And then some of those complaints result in inspections, and we've had an average of 10 inspections over the last few years in Southern Nevada and 3 in Northern Nevada. So to address this, since this is a concern of our agency as well, we do have a proposed regulation that we have been working on. We held a workshop on it on March 4th, and the adoption hearing will be held on April 20th. So it requires employers with employees subject to certain high temperatures to do the following, and I'll just give you a brief summary. Include a program for management of heat stress in their written safety program, which is already required by law. Also, encourage employees to frequently hydrate. Ensure that employees have ready access to potable drinking water. provide access to shade to employees that may be suffering from heat illness, and provide training to employees and supervisors on heat illness. And then in the case that an employee actually does start to show signs of heat illness, then the regulation would require the employer to relieve the employee from duty, provide the employee with sufficient means to reduce their body temperature, and monitor the employee to determine whether medical attention is necessary. So that concludes my remarks, and we are happy to be of assistance in helping be a complement to AB 249. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carrion, for being here today. Chair, with your permission, I would like to go to Ms. Kelly Gaines next.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Flores and Vice Chair Torres and committee members. For the record, my name is Kelly Gaines. I'm the president of the Nevada Subcontractors Association. I'm here alongside virtually with Assemblywoman Howdy and Victoria in support of AB 249. The Nevada Subcontractors Association represent 150 residential contractors, subcontractors, construction vendors, and suppliers and businesses alike. These companies employ thousands upon thousands of Southern Nevada residents. For us, our number one priority in the construction space is to create and adhere to safety standards to protect employees and still have a positive impact in our economic development. With current restrictions on construction start times, it exposes our workers to extreme heats during the summer months and inability to complete full workdays during the summer. Very simply, our perspective is the passing of this bill will be giving them our workers the ability to work full time during the summer months with limiting their exposure to the high heat indexes, overall creating safer workspaces. So that's kind of concludes really what I have, but I'll still be on the call for any questions. So I just wanted to thank you guys for hearing that.
Thank you, Chair Flores. We are now ready for questions. I did want to point out that we did work with local governments, and one of the reasons we restructured the bill this way is that throughout Nevada, some local governments don't have restrictions on start times and constructions, and some do, and that's why this is something that I'd like to continue the conversation on moving forward into the interim. With our virtual setting, it just kind of made it difficult to do it during this legislative session, but something that I do want to work on during the interim. And what I feel that AB 249 accomplishes is that at least it gets the needle moving so that during the interim, during the next few summer months, construction workers can get the earlier start times in the local governments where start times could be 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. without the restrictions of CICs where they might say, construction can't start here till 9. Well, if a crew is getting there at 9 to set up in August and they're not starting on the roof until 10 a.m. after they're fully set up, we all know that at 10 a.m. in August in Las Vegas, we can already be facing temperatures in the triple digits. And so my intent with carrying AB 249 has always just been from a viewpoint of worker safety and making sure that we are providing the safest work environment for all Nevadans throughout the state.
Thank you, Assemblywoman, and appreciate your work on this bill. With that, we'll open it up to questions, and we'll start with our very passionate Assemblyman Ellison, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hedege, I really like the bill, and as we're down visiting Las Vegas, I couldn't believe some of the people working in that heat. But in rural Nevada, our construction season is totally different than Southern Nevada versus Northern Nevada. We have harsh winters, so sometimes we've got to get in there and get a lot of this work done. And the 7 o'clock a.m. on a lot of these projects, I think is great because a lot of people say don't come in, but I think that's a great idea. But it's just going to stay for Northern Nevada. This will be the whole state law as intended right now. Is that correct?
Correct, Mr. Ellison, and it would not impact your construction during the winter months because the amended bill specifies that this is only during those few summer months.
Okay. And we appreciate it. We don't have the heat that you have in the summer months. And in our business where you're handling conduit and stuff, down in Vegas. I don't know how they do that without gloves, because I tell you what, it's miserable in a couple of the months where we have maybe 101 to 105 at the worst conditions at most times in the summer. So I thank you, and thank you for bringing the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Ellison.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Members, any additional questions? I am now checking the chat to ensure that we don't have any additional questions. I don't believe I see anybody requesting a question, but please feel free to unmute yourself at this time if I accidentally skipped you. Thank you, Assemblywoman Jauregui. I think everybody's on board in terms of your presentation. I don't think we have any additional questions. So at this time, I'd like to invite those wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 249. And we will go to the phone lines. Broadcast, please.
To testify in support of Assembly Bill 249, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 888, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Assembly Committee on Government Affairs. My name is Vincent, Vinson, Guthreau, Gutreau. I serve as the Deputy Director of the Nevada Association of Counties. And with the amendment presented, NACO is supportive of AB 249. NACO specifically wants to thank Assemblywoman Jauregui for working with local government stakeholders and understanding our perspective and presenting this amendment that recognizes the importance of each community deciding at the local level what works best. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to testify on AB 249.
And thank you for joining us. We'll continue with support on Assembly Bill 249. Next caller, please.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 184, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Matt Walker, Mattwalker, and I'm pleased to be calling in support of Assembly Bill 249 on behalf of the Southern Nevada homebuilders this morning. As the sponsor mentioned, reasonable and predictable start times are an important protection for worker safety. This bill recognizes that there are several components to what constitutes those start times. We think this is a great start to the conversation, and we look forward to working with the sponsor in the continued conversation in the interim. In addition to what's already been placed on the record about worker safety, there's also some tasks that can't be performed, like concrete pours and air conditioning recharge, air conditioning charge, coolant charge in high heat environments. And so having that reasonable start time isn't just super important for worker safety, but also for achieving the tasks within manufacturer's specifications as we need to during the course of standard construction projects. So again, really positive conversation, and I look forward to continued evolution of these proposals. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this morning. Next caller in support of Assembly Bill 249.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 417, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning. My name is Jordan Cranebuhl, JORDAN, I am the Executive Director of the Plumbing, Heating, Cooling Contractors of Nevada. I am speaking in favor of AB 249. This bill and allowing earlier start times goes a long way to protect our workers. Many times our workers are out in the exposed sunlight doing undergrounds and getting on roofs, things like that. So we are in favor of this bill and for the protection of our workers. Thank you.
And thank you. Next caller wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 249?
Caller, with the last three digits of 116, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Alexis Motorex, Alexis Motarex, with the Nevada Chapter Associated General Contractors representing the commercial construction industry in Northern Nevada. We are here in support of AB 249 as presented with the amendment. We'd like to thank the sponsor for taking the time to meet with us and listening to our concerns, and we look forward to participating in the ongoing conversations on the matter.
And thank you for joining us. Next caller wishing to testify in support of Assembly Bill 249.
To testify in support of Assembly Bill 249, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no more callers in support at this time.
Thank you. At this time, I'll invite those of you wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 249.
To testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 249, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no callers in opposition at this time.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to invite those wishing to testify in the neutral position to Assembly Bill 249.
To testify in the neutral position on Assembly Bill 249, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller, with the last three digits of 994, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Thank you, Chair Flores and committee members, for the opportunity to testify in the neutral position on AB 249. My name is Darren Tedford, Darin Tedford. I am the Deputy Director for Project Delivery at the Nevada Department of Transportation. Upon review of the current and proposed amendment language of AB 249, I offer the following comments on behalf of NDOT. NDOT delivers millions of dollars of transportation-related projects statewide every year. These projects include improvements to interstates, rural roads, and local city streets throughout our communities. NDOT coordinates with local governments, groups, and citizens to plan and construct these projects. The Nevada contracting community prepares bids for these projects based on many variables, including allowed work zone lengths and allowed working hours. There may be cost impacts to NDOT projects by reducing allowed working hours. The time it takes to construct projects may be extended due to restricted working hours. Evening, nighttime, and early morning work also allows reduced traffic restrictions during the day, reducing delays for the traveling public. Most importantly, we believe and agree that safety for workers and the traveling public is increased during evening, nighttime, and early morning work while there are fewer drivers on the road. That concludes my comments. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and as always, NDOT is available to answer any questions and provide any information that is requested.
And thank you for joining us. I don't think we have any questions at this time. I am checking the chat, however. Seeing none, thank you again for joining us. Next caller wishing to testify in the neutral position.
Sure. There are no more callers in the neutral position at this time.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Jauregui, any closing remarks you may have?
Just brief ones, Chair Flores. Again, I just want to thank the committee for hearing Assembly Bill 249. My intent, again, has always been worker safety for our construction workers who have to work during the extreme summer heat. Summer is often peak construction season, especially with it being the busiest time during the housing market. So sometimes there is no choice but to continue working even on the hottest days. I think the amended AB 249 helps us target the two biggest dangers of working in summer, heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So thank you, members. And I ask for your support of Assembly Bill 249.
Thank you again, Assemblywoman. At this time, we'll go ahead and close out the hearing on Assembly Bill 249, and we'll go to our last item on the agenda, which is public comment. I want to remind those of you who wish to join us this morning for public comment, we encourage you to do so. We want people to call in, but I want to remind you that this is not a time for you to try to reopen debate on a previously heard matter or hearing, better said. This is just a time for you to speak about general matters that fall within the purview of our committee. I don't want to discourage anybody from calling, but if you try to reopen a debate of a previously heard matter, we're going to have to ask you to be cut off. At this time, public comment, please broadcast.
To take place in the public comment queue, please press *9 now. Chair, the public line is open and working, but there are no more callers at this time.
Thank you. Members, I appreciate the thoughtful dialogue today. We'll continue with somewhat of a busy schedule for the remainder of the week. As I have indicated, we'll have 3, 4, 5 hearings per day. Tomorrow, March 30th, please make sure you give yourself an opportunity to review Assembly Bill 249, Assembly Bill 340, and Assembly Bill 378. Excuse me. I just read over today's agenda. For tomorrow, we have, I'm going to the agenda now. We have Assembly Bill 313, 336, and 357. Please give yourself an opportunity to review those documents. Again, thank you for the thoughtful dialogue this morning, and I will see you all tomorrow. This meeting's adjourned.
Thanks, boss.